A moment later I turned off the TV and went out into the gym. Kids had started to come out of the locker rooms in their gym clothes. The last few stragglers dashed out carrying their sneakers. I'd made a new rule. Anyone who couldn't change in 2 minutes had to give me a push-up for every 5 seconds they were late. And guess who was late? Give me 6, Sherman, I barked as Mr. Braun, in my body, jogged out of the locker room 30 seconds late. But Ms. Rogers kept me after class, he said. Got a late pass. Mr. Braun shook my head, then on the floor. Mr. Braun got down on the gym floor and did 6 pitiful push-ups. My back dipped like an old horse's and he could barely straighten my arms. I couldn't believe what a wimp I looked like. Okay, class, I said. Today we'll continue our fitness program with wind sprints, push-ups, and sit-ups. And just for fun we'll end the class with a crab walk relay race. The whole class groaned. By then Mr. Braun had finished his push-ups. He raised my hand. What is it now, Sherman? I asked. Yesterday after class 1 read the physical education curriculum, he said. It says that we're supposed to be doing badminton this week. Badminton is for wimps, I said. That's not exactly correct, he said. It's good for hand-eye coordination and it's an excellent introduction to racket sports. Thank you for that enlightening information, I grumbled. Everybody up for wind sprints. With a lot of muttering and grumbling, the class stood up. Julia Sachs raised her hand. Yes, Julia, I called on her. Aren't we supposed to stretch before we start any intensive physical activity? She asked. How thoughtless of me, I cried. Okay, class, Julia will now lead you in stretching. They stretched for a couple of minutes and then started running. Amber was sitting on the bleachers so I went over and sat down next to her. So, have you done a lot of modeling? I asked. Amber shook her head. Not really. Are you nervous? I feel funny, but I don't think it's nervousness, she said. Then what is it? I guess I'm just not sure I really like the idea, Amber said. My mom says they'll pay me a lot of money if they decide to use me for the ad. But it's not like I'm doing anything to earn it. I mean, it's not like I learned a skill or anything. All you basically have to do is stand there. What's wrong with that? I asked. The only reason they want me is because of the way I look. It feels really superficial. I know what you mean. I nodded. Amber gave me a funny look. Do you? Sure, I said. People shouldn't care about what you look like. It's what's inside that counts. If you really feel that way, why did you work so hard to have such big muscles? She asked. I didn't know what to say. I don't mean to be rude or anything, Mr. Braun, Amber went on, but don't you lift all those weights because you think it makes your body look cool. It's more than that, I tried to explain. It's eating good healthy food, and iron, zinc, and potassium, from Montana. Amber scowled at me. Can't you eat good healthy food without needing to grow big muscles? Just then a commotion broke out over by the rope climbing area. The kids had finished the wind sprints and had broken up into smaller group activities. I got up and went over. To tell you the truth, I wasn't sorry to leave Amber. I got the feeling she didn't like Mr. Braun that much. A bunch of kids were standing around in a circle. I'll get you for this, a familiar voice threatened from inside the circle. That's a laugh, another familiar voice chuckled. I pushed through the circle and found Mr. Braun, in my body, pointing at Barry Dunn. He did an air hanky on me. Did not. Dunn shouted back. An angry spark appeared in Mr. Braun's eye. Yes, you did. Oh, yeah, Dunn grumbled. Then where's the evidence? Mr. Braun threw my hands up in disgust. See, Barry Dunn gloated. You got no proof. Then it was spit, Mr. Braun said. Okay, what happened? I asked. They both started to talk at the same time. Basically it sounded like Dunn had been up on the rope and Mr. Braun had been below and some liquid had hit him in the head. It must have been sweat, Dunn said. Bull. Mr. Braun growled. It was either flying goobers or spit. Or maybe you were just drooling, you dumb ape. Why you? Dunn charged Mr. Braun, but I stepped in the way. That's enough you two, I said. Come with me. Where? Mr. Braun, in my body, asked. We'll settle this like men. I led them over to the equipment closet. Inside were some old boxing gloves, and the protective headgear boxers wear when they spar. I gave them each a set. Cool. Dunn had a big, mean leer on his face. He slipped the gloves on and went off to find a friend to lace them up. Meanwhile, Mr. Braun, in my body, looked appalled. What are you doing? I think it's time you stood up to Dunn, I said. If you don't stand up to him, he's just going to pick on you forever. Mr. Braun clenched his jaw firmly. Just when it looked like he was going to get really peeved, he suddenly relaxed. A small smile even appeared on his face, almost like a smirk. Serves me right, he said with an ironic chuckle. I must say, Mr. Braun, you've developed a wry sense of revenge. Was it my imagination, or was his vocabulary improving? Over in the corner of the gym, some wrestling mats were spread out on the floor, covering about the same area as a boxing ring. Dunn was waiting there, tapping his gloves together and bouncing on his toes like a professional boxer. Mr. Braun, in my body, walked toward him, and I followed. Excuse me, Mr. Braun. I turned and found Amber behind me. Yes. Why are you doing this? Her brow was furrowed and she looked angry and upset. Because Dunn's going to keep picking on kids until someone stands up to him, I said. And you really think that by giving him a chance to beat up Jake he's going to learn his lesson? Amber asked skeptically. We'll have to see, I said. Amber didn't answer. She just stared daggers at me. Julia Sachs came up and blocked my path. I don't think you're allowed to do this, Mr. Braun. I won't let anyone get hurt, I said. How are you going to do that? She asked. I didn't answer. All I could think about was how I was going to get my revenge for all those times when Mr. Braun called me a wuss and put me down because I wouldn't stand up to Dunn. Dunn and Mr. Braun had already taken corners on the mat. The rest of the gym class stood around the edges. I stepped into the middle of the mat and motioned the boxers to step forward. Mr. Braun, in my body, and Dunn came to the middle and faced each other. Okay, boys, fight clean, I said. No hitting below the belt. No headbutts. When I tell you to break, you break. Both boys nodded and went back to their corners. Okay, I clapped my hands together. Round 1. Dunn bounded across the mats toward Mr. Braun, who held up his gloves and waited, almost impassively. Dunn took a big swing at Mr. Braun's, my head. Just when it looked as if he was going to cream him, Mr. Braun ducked and punched Dunn in the side, making him double over and grimace for a second. A big cheer went up around the mat. It seemed as if almost everyone was rooting for me, Mr. Braun. After getting hit, Dunn backed away from me with a surprised look on his face. Then he got serious. I ended the bout when Mr. Braun's, my nose started to bleed. Mr. Braun had put up a heroic fight, but he was no match for Dunn, who left the mats with his arms raised triumphantly and a big smile on his face, even though everyone was booing him. Andy ran into the bathroom and got a couple of ice packs to keep the swelling down. Then he, Josh, and Alex walked with Mr. Braun back to the locker room. Mr. Braun walked with my head held high. He must have been hurting, but he wouldn't let it show. Boy, you sure have gotten brave, Jake, Andy told him, and for once he wasn't joking. Yeah, agreed Josh. I can't believe how you hung in there, Jake. That was really awesome. The rest of the kids went to change out of their gym clothes. Suddenly the gym was empty and quiet. Everyone was gone except for me and Amber. She was still glaring at me with fury in her eyes. It made me feel so uncomfortable that I told her to go ahead to her next class. This is the last class of the day, Mr. Braun, she replied coldly. Oh, right. How could I have forgotten? Feel good? Amber asked angrily. Actually, I didn't feel good at all. But I wouldn't admit that to her. Think Barry Dunn is going to stop picking on kids now? Amber's voice was filled with acid scorn. I felt like she was pushing the limits of the student-teacher relationship. I'd watch your mouth, I warned her. Don't forget who's the teacher and who's the student. Maybe it's just getting hard to tell, Amber shot back. Then she turned and stormed out of the gym. The vegetables in Mr. Braun's refrigerator were getting moldy, and I hadn't touched any of those vitamins or minerals either. After munching on snacks all day, I usually had a pizza for dinner. Before I'd gotten into Mr. Braun's body, the most slices I could eat at one sitting were 3. But in Braun's body I could put away a whole medium-sized pie, with sausage and mushrooms. But I was starting to have a problem with his clothes. They'd always been tight, but now they were getting tighter. One morning I discovered I couldn't get the top buttons on any of his pants closed. I had to leave the button open, and wore one of his sweatshirts to school that day, so no one would see. After school that afternoon I decided to go to the burn center. I hadn't been there since the day Mr. Braun took me. I kept meaning to go, but each day after school I'd get back to Mr. Braun's place, turn on the TV, and order a pizza. Somehow I just never got around to leaving the apartment after that. The men's and women's locker rooms were in the back of the club. I went into the men's locker room and started pulling off Mr. Braun's street clothes. Suddenly I felt a pair of eyes staring at me. I turned and found Mr. Braun, in my body, wearing a pair of shorts and no shirt. My nose looked a little swollen and a dark crescent curved under my left eye where Dunn had hit me. Mister. Braun looked really peeved. What are you doing to my body? He growled behind clenched teeth. What are you talking about? I pretended not to understand. Mister. Braun stepped closer and reached toward my waist. He took a fold of flab between his thumb and index finger and pinched it. I never had that before. Get lost. I pushed his hand away. It took me 15 years to build that body, mister. Braun said angrily. And in less than 2 weeks you've let it go to pot. Have not. You haven't been here once, he said accusingly. Have to. Liar. How would you know? I asked. Because I've been here every day, he said. What? Since Mr. Braun wasn't wearing a shirt, I gave my body a closer look. Strangely, I could see muscles in places where I'd never seen muscles before. They weren't big, but they were definitely there. You've been working out? I asked. 3 hours a day. He pulled on a t-shirt. I couldn't believe it. Why? That's not even your body. Mister. Braun shrugged my shoulders. Habit, I guess. This was fantastic, if Mr. Braun kept it up, I was going to have a great body without doing any exercises. A few moments later we left the locker room together. Out in the weight room, the muscleheads greeted me. Hey, Teddy, haven't seen you around lately. Where you been? Wow, man, looks like you're overdoing the carbo loading. You're not gonna let that body go, are ya, Ted? I dealt with their questions as best I could and headed for the sit-up machine. What are you doing, Mr. Braun, in my body, asked. Sit-ups. I pinched Mr. Braun's waist. You know, work a little of this off. You better start on a treadmill first, Mr. Braun said. Burn some calories and get yourself warmed up. I couldn't believe he was telling me what to do. Look, this isn't school, okay? I said. I do what I want. Jake. We turned around. Jessica was standing behind us, giving us both a puzzled look. Hi, Mr. Braun, she said. Hi, Jessica. I hadn't seen her in more than a week. I know it must sound kind of strange, but I sort of missed her a little. Jessica turned to Mr. Braun, in my body. Think you could spot me for bench presses, Jake? Sure, Mr. Braun replied. I just want to get a towel. He headed toward the front counter. Jessica and I waited by the bench press. So, how are things at home? I asked. Jessica scowled at me as if she couldn't understand why Mr. Braun would ask. Okay, that, dog of yours all right. Lance. Sure, he's fine. Across the weight room Jake appeared with a towel. Looks like Jake's really gotten into working out, huh? I said. Jessica nodded. I'll say. Actually, he's really changed a lot in the past few weeks. It's like he's a completely different person. Is the change for better or for worse? I asked. Definitely better, my sister said. It's like he finally decided to grow up. I grimaced. Ouch. That hurt. Mr. Braun, in my body, went to spot my sister on the bench press. I walked over to the treadmills. 3 were empty. I got a pair of headphones, climbed up on one of the treadmills, and tossed my towel on the handrail of the one next to me. A row of television monitors hung from the ceiling. At least I'd get to watch TV while I jogged. A few minutes later, Mr. Braun came by. He must have finished spotting Jessica. He got on the second treadmill, leaving the one between us free. By then FD started to work up a sweat and stopped jogging. Where are you going? He asked. To do sit-ups, I said. Mr. Braun craned my neck to read the data on my treadmill's electronic display. Only 7 minutes. Hey, I worked up a sweat, I said defensively. You've got to jog at least 20 minutes for it to mean anything, he said. I figured another couple of minutes wouldn't kill me, and got back on the treadmill. Meanwhile, Mr. Braun, in my body, started running on his treadmill. Mr. Braun, I was just thinking about something interesting, he said as he ran. Have you ever wondered why people lift weights and build up their bodies so fanatically? Sure, I said. They want to look good and feel strong. Don't you think that's kind of simplistic? Mr. Braun asked. Mr. Braun was asking me if something was simplistic. Wow, was that a switch or what? Well, what do you think the answer is? I asked. Everyone knows you get more strength from doing high reps with medium weight, so strength really isn't the issue, Mr. Braun said. Once again it seemed like he was starting to sound smarter, so then you have to consider looks, Mr. Braun went on. Why is it so important to look strong? What does it say about people if they have to spend so much of their lives worried about their appearance? Don't ask me, I said, lowering my voice to a whisper. You're the one who spent 15 years doing it. Right, Mr. Braun didn't get mad like I expected he would. Instead, he said, "It seems to me that someone has to be pretty insecure to go through all that trouble just to look strong." "Whatever you say," I replied. I wasn't keen on all this psychological mumbo-jumbo. "Is this treadmill taken?" someone asked. I turned and came face to face with Amber. She was pointing at the treadmill between Mr. Braun and me. I reached over and pulled my towel off the rail. "It's yours. Thanks." Amber stepped up on the treadmill. I was glad she was there, because I felt like we'd parted on bad terms after gym class that day. Amber started jogging and scanned the TV shows on the monitors. But just as I turned to talk to her, she turned to Mr. Braun in my body. "How are you, Jake?" she asked. It seemed like she caught him by surprise. "Oh, you mean the nose. It's just a little swollen. I thought you were really brave to fight that jerk," Amber said. "Well, it wasn't like I had a choice, Mr. Braun said loudly, like he wanted to make sure I heard. Amber gave me an unfriendly look and turned back to him. "I really wish there was something someone could do about that bully," she said. Mr. Braun, in my body, nodded. "It's really too bad the school doesn't do something about him," Amber said. Again, I got the feeling she said it so I could hear. "There's just so much they can do," Mr. Braun replied. "Dun's a pain, but he isn't really a threat. It's not like he seriously injures people." "I guess," Amber said. "I just don't understand why Principal Blanco doesn't suspend him or something. Then he'd stop." "Dunn doesn't care if he gets suspended," I said. "And Principal Blanco doesn't know how bad it is because most of the kids won't tell him. They don't want to look like crybabies. So why don't you tell Principal Blanco?" Amber asked. Oops. For a moment there I'd forgotten whose body I was in. Or better yet, the next time Dunn spits on Jake, instead of making Jake fight him, why don't you punish Dunn? Amber added sharply. "But I didn't see him spit," I tried to explain. "Oh, please, Mr. Braun." Amber scoffed. "Do you think Jake really made that up?" She had a good point. Still, I knew there had to be a reasonable argument. If only I could think of it. Just then the front door to the health club swung open and Josh and Andy came in. That caught me totally by surprise. I almost asked what they were doing there when I realized that it probably wasn't something Mr. Braun would normally ask. They headed straight for the treadmills. "Hey, Jake, is it true?" Andy gasped excitedly. Mr. Braun quickly put my finger to my lips. "SHHHHHH." He nodded at me. Andy and Josh glanced my way and got the message. Whatever was going on, Mr. Braun didn't want me to know about it. "What is it?" Amber gasped, leaning toward them. Josh whispered something in her ear. Unfortunately, with the music playing and everyone around us exercising, she couldn't hear. "What?" she said. Josh raised his voice. I said, "Jake challenged the Dunns to a rematch." Everyone looked at me. Then Mr. Braun, in my body, glared at Josh, who bit his lip and looked totally guilty. "Oops, sorry," he said sheepishly. "Really?" Amber gasped. Mr. Braun acted as if it were no big deal. Amber's eyes went wide. She was looking at him in my body as if he were some kind of hero. Andy and Josh were looking at him the same way. I hate to say it, but I was starting to feel really jealous. Only, how could I be jealous of myself? It was 2 days until Christmas vacation. The joy of making all the kids in school kill themselves in gym was starting to wear thin, and living in Mr. Braun's apartment made me feel lonely. And I had some other problems. One was that I'd started to feel really thick-skulled. It was a serious challenge just to think. Coming up with ideas and solving problems used to be easy for me, but now using my brain was like trudging through thick drifts of heavy, wet snow. The other problem was that Bertha had called from the Ms. Galaxy pageant in California. She talked about how much she missed me and how she'd be home very soon. I hated to admit it, but even though I was in Mr. Braun's big strong body, the prospect of seeing his beautiful girlfriend made me nervous. It was the last period of school and my old gym class was changing in the locker rooms. Everyone hurried out to the gym. When the bell rang, I looked around and realized only one person was missing, Jake Sherman. Half a minute passed, then a minute. Then 2 minutes. At 2 minutes and 15 seconds, Mr. Braun, in my body, raced out of the boys' locker room. He didn't even wait for me to say anything. Instead, he got down on the floor and proceeded to do 27 perfect push-ups. One for every 5 seconds of lateness. When he finished, a bunch of kids cheered. Mr. Braun, in my body, stood up and waved at them with a big smile on his face. He wasn't even minded. The funny thing was, I wouldn't have made him do those push-ups this time. Like I said, I was tired of being Mr. Mean. "So what are we gonna do today, Mr. Braun. Howie Jameson asked. Why bother asking, bonehead? Alex Silver chastised him. You know it'll be the same thing we always do. Sprints, push-ups, sit-ups, the whole 9 yards. Wrong. I shook my head. Actually, today I'm giving you a free period. Play basketball, fool around, talk to your friends, whatever you like. 40 kids stared back at me with shocked looks on their faces. Is this a joke, Mr. Braun? Andy asked. No, but I want to see you and Hopka in my office. Why? Josh asked. What did we do? Nothing. I turned and went into the office. Inside, I sat down at the desk, turned on the TV, and ripped open a new bag of chips. Through the window I could see that a bunch of kids had gotten out a basketball and were playing a half-court game. Others were sitting around talking. Only one kid elected to do the sprints we normally did, Mr. Braun, in my body. Andy and Josh came into the office looking nervous. Want some? I held the open bag of chips toward them. My friends shared a frown, then each reached into the bag, felt around for a good-sized chip, and took it out. Thanks, Mr. Braun, Josh said uncertainly as he munched on his chip. Have a seat, I said. With puzzled looks on their faces, they sat down in the chairs on the other side of my desk. I slid a cassette of Terminator 2 into the VCR. It felt good to be sitting around with my pals again, eating junk food and watching Schwarzenegger mash bad guys. I held the bag out again. More. Sure, thanks. Josh and Andy each took another chip. Excuse me, Mr. Braun, Andy said, but is there a reason why you wanted to see us? I reached into the bag and pulled out a handful of chiplets. Not really. Out in the gym, Jake had finished with his wind sprints. Now he was sitting on the floor with his knees bent. Alex Silver held his ankles while he did dozens of rapid, effortless sit-ups. Not far away, Barry Dunn stood with one of his friends, watching. Dunn's forehead was wrinkled. He actually looked worried. Can you believe Sherman? I asked with a smile. I was turning back to watch the movie when I noticed that both Josh and Andy were staring at me wide-eyed, as if they'd suddenly realized something. They looked back out the window at Mr. Braun, in my body, exercising as hard as he could. Then they looked at me in Mr. Braun's body with my feet up on the desk, munching on a handful of chiplets and watching the movie. I suddenly realized what I'd done. Sitting up, I quickly wiped my hands on Mr. Braun's sweatpants. Then, trying to sound more like Mr. Braun than Mr. Braun himself, I said, all right, boys. Better get moving. But my friends didn't move. They just looked at me and then at each other. You thinking what I'm thinking? Andy asked Josh. Josh nodded. Yeah, suddenly it's all starting to make sense. What's making sense? I asked innocently. Andy said. No, I don't, I said, but if you are not out on that gym floor in 5 seconds, you are going to be cleaning the bathroom with a paintbrush. A toothbrush. Andy pointed a finger at me. Don't go anywhere, he said. I'll be back. 10 minutes later, Andy hurried back into the office, followed by Jessica. She studied me like I was an alien or something. Andy's face was red and he was panting. I could only imagine that he'd just snuck out of school and run over to the high school to get Jessica. It's against the rules to leave this property during school hours, I said. I'm afraid I'm going to have to report you to Principal Blanco. Get stuffed, bozo. Andy turned to my sister. Tell him what you told me on the way here. I said that Jake was acting really different, Jessica said. Like he was a whole new person. They looked out the office window at Mr. Braun in my body, who was now doing push-ups. His body was as straight as a board. Then they turned back to me. I'd just put a big handful of chiplets in my mouth. And the night of the big snowstorm. Andy asked Jessica. My sister told how Mr. Braun had stayed at our house. Wait a minute, Josh gasped. That was the night before the science fair. Mr. Dirkson's experiment was here in the gym. Alex and Jake stayed late for detention. I don't know what you're talking about, Hopka, I said, trying to act tough. Then I pointed to Jessica. And you don't even belong here. Andy opened the gym office door and yelled for Alex. A moment later he came in. When he saw Josh and Jessica, he scowled. What's going on? That's what I'd like to know, I said with as much bluster as I could muster. You're really in trouble, Kent. Just keep your mouth shut, Andy grunted. Ha, Alex's jaw dropped. Did you just tell Mr. Braun to keep his mouth shut? You ain't seen nothin' yet, Andy glowered. I can't believe how hard this guy made us work in gym these last few weeks. I could kill him. Hey, Andy, get a grip, Alex cautioned him. Remember that night you and Jake stayed in the gym for detention? Andy asked Alex. Yeah, the night of the big snowstorm, Alex said. What did you do? Josh asked. We helped move Mr. Dirkson's experiment in for the science fair, Alex said. Then what? Jessica asked. Alex frowned. I went to wait outside for my mom. Why? Where were Jake and Mr. Braun? Josh asked. In the gym, Alex said. Where was Mr. Dirkson? Andy asked. He went home because of the storm. So Jake and Mr. Braun were alone in the gym with Mr. Dirkson's experiment. Jessica asked. Yeah, why? Did anything weird happen? Andy asked. Alex thought for a moment. Well, actually, yes. First there was a power failure, then some kind of explosion. Explosion? Jessica gasped. Yeah, Alex said. Then my mom came and I went to get them. Jake and Mr. Braun were having a fight. Then Mr. Braun went home with Jake. Why? What's this all about? Andy just shook his head. Thanks, man, you can go. Aren't you gonna tell me what's going on? Alex asked. You'd never believe us. Andy showed Alex to the office door and closed it behind him. Then he turned back to me. You low-life phlegmwad, making us do all those wind sprints and push-ups. Those crab walk races, Josh added. Pull-ups. Andy grumbled. Sit-ups. Josh said angrily. Jessica pointed out the window at Mr. Braun, in my body. I can't believe I let that man see me in my pajamasel. Josh pointed an accusing finger at me. You made me take gym with sore toes. Hey, forget it, I said. That was the lamest excuse ever. You made me take gym with a twisted ankle, Andy growled. I was on crutches. You healed, didn't you? I said, reaching into the bag of chips and taking out another handful of chiplets. Gimme that. Josh snatched the bag away from me. I'm gonna get you for this, Jake, Andy threatened. Hey, bozo, as far as everyone else is concerned, I'm still your gym teacher, I said. You try to tell Principal Blanco I switched bodies with Mr. Braun and you're gonna wind up in some psycho ward somewhere. Andy drummed his fingers on Mr. Braun's desk, then turned to Josh and Jessica. Listen, guys. Mr. Dirkson moved the experiment into his room here at school. Tomorrow's the last day before Christmas vacation. If we're gonna switch them back, it's got to be tomorrow. I listened in amazement as my sister and my two best friends came up with a plan. They all agreed that they'd have to tell Mr. Dirkson, and that the best time to make the switch would be at the end of the day. Half the school would be gone by then and the other half would be so preoccupied with getting out that they probably wouldn't even notice that something out of the ordinary was going on. The way they were talking, you would have thought I wasn't even in the room. Wait a minute, guys, I finally said. Has it occurred to any of you that I might not want to switch back to my old body? Josh, Jessica, and Andy looked at each other. He's got a point, my sister said. Frankly, I like the new Jake a lot more than the old one. All I have to do is start wearing a robe. Gee, thanks, I said with a sniff. Andy shook his head. You're switching back, Jake. There's no way you're gonna be my gym teacher for the rest of the year. You can't make me, I said. The three of them grew quiet. Then Josh shook his head slowly. No wonder Jake had the guts to fight the dunce. I should. He realized right then that he wasn't the same wuss I've known all these years. That really ticked me off. Who did they think they were? After all, if I wanted to, I could be Mr. Braun forever. I could bench press 400 pounds. I had a girlfriend who'd just competed in the Ms. Galaxy pageant, with one hand tied behind my back. I could demolish all three of them, and Barry done. Josh started to stick his hand into my bag of chips. I leaned over the desk and grabbed it away. That's it, I barked. All of you, get OUTL. That night in Mr. Braun's apartment I ordered a pizza and watched TV. I was still really ticked. I didn't have to switch back if I didn't want to, and they couldn't make me. I didn't care who they told. No one was going to believe them. And even if someone did, it was tough noogies. Ding dong. The doorbell rang. Figuring it was the pizza delivery, I answered it. But the pizza delivery guy wasn't standing outside. Bertha was. I'd forgotten about her. Teddy. Her eyes got watery and she threw her arms around my neck and hugged me. I swallowed nervously and backed out of her grasp. Oh, hi, Bertha, how was the pageant? Bertha shook her head sadly and started to unbutton her coat. The same old problem, Teddy. I watched her unbutton the coat. Oddly, it looked about 5 sizes too big. What problem? I asked. The judges always criticize me for extreme muscularity. Bertha pulled off her coat. They're so sexist. They just can't deal with a woman with lots of hard, dense muscle. Bertha tossed her coat on the couch. I felt my jaw drop. She was totally muscle bounded from the neck up. She was definitely attractive, but from the neck down she had the biggest muscles I'd ever seen on any woman anywhere. Wah. What kind of pageant is Ms. Galaxy? I stammered. Bertha scowled. A bodybuilding competition. You know that, Teddy. Is something wrong? Looking worried, Bertha stepped toward me. I stepped back. There was no way I could deal with this. No way. The next thing I knew, two mammoth muscular arms went around me and squeezed so hard that I could hardly breathe. Hey, come on, honey, she whispered in my ear, sending a shiver down my spine. It's me, Bertha, your big mushy wooshy lovey poo. Suddenly it was time to switch bodies. There must have been a power surge when the emergency generator kicked in, Mr. Dirksen said as he fiddled with the dials on the experiment. Jessica, Josh, Andy, Mr. Braun in my body, and I were in the science lab. It was the last period of school before Christmas vacation. How come you suddenly changed your mind? Andy asked me. I glanced out of the corner of my eye at Mr. Braun, in my body. Bertha came home last night. And, Mr. Braun raised my eyebrows curiously. Let's just say she was really happy to see me, you, Mr. Braun squinted my eyes suspiciously. She's a very nice person, I added quickly. I can see how you two have a lot in common. Meanwhile, Jessica was looking up at the clock over the lab door. 5 minutes left, Mr. Dirksen. We better hurry. You know what happens the second school's over. I'm hurrying, Mr. Dirksen replied. I just want to make sure everything's in order before we begin. As soon as the last bell rang, everyone who was still at school was going to bolt like wild horses out of a corral. Mr. Blanco and the janitors would come around and shut the place down as fast as they could. Jessica turned to me. I hope you've learned something from this experience. Sure, I said. The bigger you are, the more pizza you can eat. Jessica rolled her eyes. Figures. I've learned quite a lot, actually, said Mr. Braun, in my body. In fact, this experience has caused me to reassess my entire philosophy of life. Quite frankly, I've come to realize that there must be some higher purpose to our existence than simply striving for big muscles. If you consider the Western existential philosophers, then perhaps having big muscles is as legitimate as any other pursuit. But if you take a more Darwinian outlook, specifically that we should endeavor to enhance the species for the sake of future generational survival, well, that certainly brings into question such an egocentric pursuit as bodybuilding. Josh scrunched up his face. What is he talking about? Don't ask me. Jessica shook her head wearily. But it's really starting to get annoying. Last night he went on for hours about the nature of the universe. I was just about ready to barf. That's really not an acceptable word, Jessica, Mr. Braun, in my body, corrected her. Regurgitate would be a more fitting description. Jessica turned to Mr. Dirksen. Would you please switch them back NOWV? I think we're ready, Mr. Dirksen replied. I hope so, Andy said, eyeing the clock. There's less than a minute left before school ends. All right, Mr. Dirksen said. Mr. Braun and Jake, take your positions. Josh, please turn off the lights. Why, Mr. Dirksen? Josh asked as he went to the light switch by the door. We're going to need every ounce of energy we can draw, Mr. Dirksen explained. Josh flicked the light switch off and the room became dim. Mr. Dirksen turned some knobs and his experiment began to hum. All right now, he said, peering at some dials. Just a few more moments. Buzz. The final school bell rang. Andy gasped. Don't worry, Kent. Mr. Dirksen peered at the dials. The whirring sound was growing louder. It'll just take another moment. 4, 3, 2, 1. I felt a slight jolt. Then the door to the lab opened. Principal Blanco stepped in and flicked the light switch on. Whoomp. Everything went black. I opened my eyes. I was lying on my back, on the cold hard floor of the science lab. Everything was spinning, but I managed to focus on the ring of faces staring down at me with awestruck expressions. Mr. Dirksen, Jessica, Principal Blanco, Andy, Josh, and Mr. Braun. When I saw Mr. Braun's face, I relaxed. We'd made the switch. Jake, are you okay? Jessica gasped. I think so. Still feeling dizzy, I pushed myself up to a sitting position. I guess I must have fainted or something. The others shared a worried look. Oh, my gosh. Mr. Braun gasped. No, this can't be true. What is it? I asked, still trying to shake the cobwebs out of my head. It didn't work, Andy said. 104. Sure it did, I said, pointing at Mr. Braun. He's Mr. Braun and I'm. My words trailed off as I focused on the arm I was pointing with. It was a huge, muscular arm. I knew Mr. Braun had been exercising my body really hard, but there was no way I could have grown muscles as big as these. I looked at Mr. Braun, who was looking down at his body. Only it wasn't his body. It was mine. What's going on in here? Principal Blanco demanded. He focused on me and scowled. What happened to you, Sherman? Somehow, only our heads had switched. Mine was now on Mr. Braun's body, and vice versa. I glanced at Mr. Dirksen, who shook his head furiously. He didn't want me to tell the principal what had happened. I had a feeling I knew why. Principals probably took a dim view of teachers who used their students as guinea pigs in science experiments. I've been working out really hard, I said. You don't say. Principal Blanco arched his eyebrows skeptically. I'm sure you're aware of the dangers of steroid use, Sherman. Principal Blanco, I can vouch for the fact that Jake has never even seen a steroid, Jessica interrupted. He's been on a new fitness regimen, and it's had amazing results. Till say. Principal Blanco turned to Mr. Braun, who was still staring down at my body, looking crushed. And what happened to you, Ted? Mr. Braun didn't know what to say. Behind Principal Blanco, Mr. Dirksen was still waving his arms frantically and shaking his head. I've been on this crash diet, Mr. Braun finally said. Principal Blanco scratched his head, then looked at his watch. I don't know what's going on here, but I'm taking my family down to Disney World in a few hours. We've got a 6 o'clock flight, and I have to close up the school first. So all of you have to clear out immediately. But, Mr. Dirksen and Mr. Braun gasped simultaneously. No buts, Principal Blanco stated firmly. School is officially closed for Christmas vacation. None of you are supposed to be here. So get going. We picked up our stuff and, in a group, walked out through the main entrance of school. Bang! One of the janitors slammed the door behind us and locked it. A moment later all the lights inside went off. We stood silently on the curb and watched as Principal Blanco walked across the parking lot to his car. He paused for a second and looked back at us with a puzzled expression on his face. Then he shook his head, got in, and drove away. A moment later the janitors also got into their cars and left. The sky was gray and getting dark. The trees were bare and still in the windless air. As we stood outside in the cold, I wondered what was on TV that night. Now what? Jessica asked. There's nothing we can do, Mr. Dirksen said hopelessly. We'll just have to wait until after vacation. I propose that on the first day back, Jake, Ted, and I get to school half an hour early. We'll have to complete the switch then. Mr. Braun spread my arms. I have to go through the whole vacation looking like this, it's not such a bad body, I said. You've really improved it. Meanwhile, you've let my body go to flab, Mr. Braun said angrily. Have not. I made a muscle. Feel that. It's still solid rock. Josh felt the muscle and nodded. It's pretty hard. Well, if you are going to have my body all vacation, try not to let it get any worse, okay? Mr. Braun snapped. Cut out all the junk food. And get into the gym a couple of hours a day. What if I don't? I asked. You'll be real sorry when we finally do switch bodies completely. But I wasn't so sure. What happened to you? My mother gasped that night when I came down for dinner. It was the first time in weeks that she and Dad had gotten home early enough to eat with Jessica and me. My father looked up from his newspaper, and his eyes bugged out. Jake, are you all right? Sure. I've been working out. I took a seat at the kitchen table. Mom and Dad gaped at each other. Then Dad knitted his eyebrows. Have you been taking steroids? He asked. No way, I said. He's been working out really hard, Jessica said, coming into the kitchen. 2 or 3 hours every day after school and on the weekends. I understand, Dad said, still staring at me. But, you're huge. Normally I would have come back with a snappy reply, but lately my brain always felt like it was on empty. Well, you know what they say, Jessica said quickly. The teenage years are times of great change. Mom and Dad were pretty flabbergasted, but there wasn't much they could do except ask more questions. The person they were talking to was definitely their son, at least from the neck up. I'd just finished dinner, including seconds and thirds, when the doorbell rang. Forget it. I jumped up and went to the front door. Josh and Andy were outside. Hey, big guy, Andy said, feel like catching a movie at the mall. I didn't understand what they were doing there. Aren't you guys mad at me? You bet we are, Josh said. But you also got us into better shape than we've been in for years, Andy added. And besides, now that you're gargantuan, we want to be seen with you. Andy grinned and winked. I winked back. I missed hanging out with my friends. Okay, I'll get my coat. Shouldn't you ask your parents first? Josh asked. I hadn't thought of that. I guess I should, huh? Nah, said Andy. When you have giant muscles, you don't have to ask anybody. I don't. Now I was confused. Was he serious or kidding? Let's just go, Andy said with a sigh. We got to the mall early and went into the music store to kill some time before the movie began. After wandering up and down the aisles for a few minutes, Andy suddenly nudged me. Hey, look, he whispered. A few rows over, Barry Dunn was browsing around in the heavy metal section. Josh joined us. Want to goof on him? How? I whispered. We huddled and Josh outlined his plan. It was kind of complicated. Could you repeat the last part? I asked him when he was done. Why? It was a little hard to follow. Josh and Andy scowled at each other. Then Josh went over the plan again. Now, are you sure you understand? He whispered when he was done. Yeah, I whispered back. Pretty sure. Okay, he whispered. Get into position. Unfortunately, I'd forgotten what my position was. Over here, Jake, Andy hissed. He and Josh were hiding behind a tall display of CDs. I joined them and crouched down so that only my head was visible above the display. Josh and Andy weren't visible at all. Get his attention, Andy whispered. Whose? I whispered back. Dunn's, you dummy. Josh hissed. I made a fist. Who are you calling a dummy? Sorry, Jake. Josh swallowed. Would you please call Barry a dork? Hey, Barry, you dork. I called across the aisle. A couple of aisles over, Dunn looked up, surprised. His face hardened when he saw me. All he could see was my head. Go on, Andy whispered. Go on what? I whispered back. Call him a dimwit, for Pete's sake, Josh hissed. You're a dimwit for Pete's sake, I said. Dunn frowned. No, Andy whispered. You're not supposed to say for Pete's sake. But Josh said I was, I whispered back. Tell him he's a headbanger, Josh whispered. You're a headbanger, I said. Dunn narrowed his eyes at me. Tell him heavy metal makes you lame, Josh whispered. Heavy metal makes me lame, I said. No, Josh hissed. It makes him lame. It makes you lame, too, I said to Dunn. Dunn smirked and nodded as if he understood what I was doing. Let me guess, Sherman. You're trying to get me mad, so I'll pick a fight with you right here. I looked down at Josh and Andy and whispered, that's not the plan, is it? They both rolled their eyes and groaned. Can't wait until after vacation for your rematch, huh? Dunn grinned, and started toward me. Okay, geek, let's do it. Just because you've been working out for a couple of weeks doesn't mean you know how to fight. A moment later, Dunn was only one aisle away. Okay, go, Andy whispered. Where? I whispered back. Instead of answering, Andy and Josh shoved me into the aisle right in front of Barry. He stopped. His eyes bulged and his jaw dropped as he looked at me. Andy stuck his head up over the CD display. Still want to fight, Barry? Dunn just stared at me. I flexed my muscles the way I'd seen Mr. Braun do it. Wah. Dunn stammered. What happened to you? He ate his Wheaties, Josh said. Now come on, tough guy, let's see you rumble. Dunn turned around and ran out of the store. Josh and Andy burst out laughing and gave each other high fives. Did you see that? Andy cried. He was totally freaked. Josh cackled. Guess he's not interested in that rematch after all. Boy, I sure wish I could have gotten that on tape. Andy said. Don't you, Jake? Why? I asked. Josh and Andy stopped laughing. For a moment they were both quiet. Josh checked his watch. Come on, it's time for the movie, he said. Before the movie started, Josh bought a container of popcorn for the three of us to share. But halfway through the previews it seemed like he got mad. He left and came back with a giant-size popcorn which he said was just for me. I thought that was really nice of him. Afterwards we decided to get some pizza. So what did you think of the movie? Andy asked as we walked through the mall toward the food court. Totally excellent, Josh said. What did you think, Jake? It was okay, I said. Just okay. Josh looked puzzled. Well, I didn't understand why the guy with the green hat cut the phone cables, I said. Because he was secretly working for the bad guys, Andy said. I mean, that was obvious, and what about the girl with the long black hair? I asked. She was supposed to be working for the bad guys. How come she saved the hero? Because she had a change of heart, Josh said. She decided the good guy was right. That was the whole point of the story. Oh, now it made more sense to me. I think I get it. Josh and Andy shared a funny look. Then Andy sighed and mumbled something about the old Jake, but I didn't quite understand what he meant. We got to the pizza place, and were just about to go in when Mr. Braun came out with Bertha. Josh and Andy looked at Mr. Braun's muscular girlfriend and had the same reaction I'd had when I first met her. Oh, hi, Mr. Braun, Andy said after he'd recovered. What are you doing here? Mr. Braun didn't look real happy to see us. We just had dinner. Bertha, this is Josh, Andy, and Jake. 3 of my students. Guys, this is Bertha. Pleased to meet you, Andy said. Yeah, Mr. Braun talks about you all the time, added Josh. You would have expected Bertha to beam proudly, but instead she gave us a taut smile. Her eyes seemed to rest on me. Just then Mr. Braun blinked as if a light bulb had gone off in his head. Know what? They overcharged us. Excuse me boys, I'll be right back. He went back into the pizza place. Meanwhile, Bertha looked me over with a warm expression on her face. You're one of Teddy's students. She asked. Yeah, I said. You didn't get those big muscles in gym class, did you? She asked. I didn't know what to say. He works out over at the burn center, Andy said. Really? Bertha looked surprised. I never saw you there. I still didn't know what to say. He usually goes late at night, Josh said. Oh, that explains it. Bertha smiled at me again. Maybe I'll have to start going late at night, too. Mr. Braun came back out of the pizza place. I knew it. Our waitress miscalculated the sales tax. She charged us 73 cents too much. Wow, Teddy, you really grew brains while I was away, Bertha said, sounding a little sarcastic. Mr. Braun smiled proudly. Well, we better get going. Have a good vacation, boys. His eyes stayed fixed on me. I'll see you when school reopens. He and Bertha left. Gee, do you believe that? Andy gasped when they were out of earshot. Believe what? I asked. A couple of weeks ago Mr. Braun couldn't figure out what to add to 14 to get 50. Now he's doing out sales tax in his head. Who cares about that? Josh said. Did you see Bertha? She's built like a refrigerator. She lifts weights, too, I said. Andy gave me a look of disbelief. No kidding, Einstein. Why'd you call me that? I asked. Forget it. Andy shook his head. Did you see the way she looked at Jake? Josh asked. You bet I did. Andy looked at me woefully. I hate to say this, but I think you're in trouble, big guy. Why? I asked. First you took Mr. Braun's body, Andy said. Now you're gonna take his girl. Every day during vacation, I went to the burn center and worked out. Now that it was my head on Mr. Braun's body, I really wanted to take good care of the whole unit. Almost every time I was there I saw Mr. Braun and Bertha. Mr. Braun never looked happy to see me, but Bertha always gave me big smiles. When I wasn't at the health club, I hung around with Andy and Josh. 2 nights before the end of vacation we went to a party at Amanda Gluck's house. Everyone was sitting around on the old couches in her rec room, talking and listening to music. Since Amber was sitting alone, I sat down next to her. Hi, Amber. Hi, Jake. She smiled crookedly. On the table in front of the couch was a big plastic bowl filled with chips. I picked it up and put it on my lap. Amber gave me a funny look. I can't believe how you've changed. I know, I said. Everyone says that. How did it happen? I couldn't tell the truth, so I said, I've been exercising super hard. I bet you've gotten really strong, she said. Oh, yeah, I can bench press 450, I said proudly. Curl 135 and snatch 275. Can you still tell a joke? She asked. Quote. It had been a while since I'd done that, and I wasn't sure. I guess I could. Would you tell me one? She asked. I could use a laugh. Sure, I said. I thought for a few moments. How come the chicken crossed the road? I don't know, why? Amber smiled in anticipation. I remembered how much I used to love her smile. To get to the other side, I said. The smile slowly faded from her face. That's it. I nodded. But that's the oldest joke in the world, she said. Really? Okay, how about this? What's got 4 wheels and flies? A garbage truck, Amber groaned. Wow, I gasped. How'd you know? Amber gazed at me in disbelief. Are you serious? Sure, I said. That was my best joke. Amber studied me with a wistful look. Then she started to get up. Where you going? I asked. To the kitchen, she said. Can I come too? Why don't you wait here? She said. I'll be right back. So I sat on the couch and ate the chips. Pretty soon I'd emptied the entire bowl. It seemed like Amber was gone for an awful long time. Then Andy and Josh came over. Hey, big guy, Josh said, what's up? I'm waiting for Amber, I said. Why? Andy frowned. She went to the kitchen. She said she'd be right back. When was that? Josh asked. Well, a pretty long time ago, actually. I bet, Andy said. Amber and a bunch of kids went outside to have a snowball fight about 45 minutes ago. Really? I wonder why she didn't tell me. Josh and Andy shared a somber look. Then Andy said, "Hey, Jake, why don't you get your jacket? Maybe you, Josh, and me should take a walk." We went outside. Snow blanketed the ground. It was dark and cold. White vapor curled from our lips as we walked. Across the street, Amber and a bunch of kids were yelling and laughing as they threw snowballs at each other. I stopped and watched Amber. I still couldn't understand why she'd left me on the couch waiting all that time. "Hey, come on, dude." Andy gave me a nudge. He, Josh, and I started to walk toward town. We passed streetlights and houses glittering with Christmas decorations. For a while, no one said anything. Then Andy said, "Listen, Jake, there's something we want to talk to you about." "Yeah, I know," I said. "I've gotten really dumb." Josh winced. "It's not like we think it's your fault or anything. Remember when I said that people with huge muscles can't be that smart because their brains don't have room?" Andy asked. "I thought that was a joke," I said. "So did I," said Andy. "Now we're not so sure," Josh said. "You've gotten totally dumb. Meanwhile, Mr. Braun is going around in your body talking about philosophy. I'll bet that 3 weeks ago he couldn't even spell philosophy," added Andy. "But I really like this body," I said. "I mean, having muscles like these is every guy's dream, isn't it?" Josh and Andy shared a glance and didn't answer. We got into town and headed into the ice cream place. No matter how cold it got, a vanilla cone with chocolate sprinkles still sounded good. The ice cream place was a big hangout for dirtbags and headbangers. So we weren't surprised to turn the corner and find Barry Dunn coming toward us. As soon as he saw us, Dunn spun around and took off down a dark side street. "Wow, you've really got the Dunns freaked," Josh said with a delighted laugh. As we walked into the ice cream place, everyone stared at me. But I was used to that, and kind of liked it. I got a vanilla cone with sprinkles and went to look for a table. Josh and Andy were still at the counter, trying different ice cream samples. They usually took forever to make up their minds. I found a table near the door and sat down. The ice cream place was lined with windows. Outside, I saw a familiar face pass on the sidewalk. It was Bertha, and when she saw me, she stopped and smiled. A second later, she came in. "Here alone. My friends are still deciding what to order." I pointed over at the counter. "I like a man who can make up his mind," Bertha said. "Mind if I sit?" No, I didn't really want her to, but it was wrong to be impolite. "I'm glad we're finally alone," Bertha said, sweeping some strands of blonde hair away from her face. "There's something really important I need to say." I licked the sprinkles off my ice cream and waited. "Do you mind if I ask how old you are?" she said. "UH, 14. I'm 19, Bertha said. "We're 5 years apart. You probably think that's a lot, right?" I nodded. "But when I'm 30 and you're 25, it won't seem like that much," she said. "UH, if you say so." I wondered what she was getting at. Bertha put her elbows on the table and leaned toward me. The table creaked. I wondered if it was going to break. "Jake," she said with a wondrous gaze, "do you realize how special you are?" I shook my head. "If you're built like this at the age of 14, do you have any idea what you're going to look like at 25? UH, Arnold Schwarzenegger." I guessed. Bertha laughed. "Jake, you're going to make Arnold Schwarzenegger look like a 90-pound weakling." Wow, it was hard to imagine Arnold Schwarzenegger as a shrimp. "You're going to be like." Bertha couldn't seem to find the word. "The Incredible Hulk," I guessed. Yes. Bertha's eyes had a glittery, lively look, and her voice was filled with excitement. "I love men with huge muscles. I know it's not fair to Teddy, but I can't help myself. You're the one for me, Jake." Ahem. Someone cleared their throat. Bertha and I looked up. Andy was standing at the table. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Oh, of course not." Bertha got up and winked at me. "See you soon, Jake." Instead of leaving, she went over to the counter. I guess she decided to have some ice cream. Josh and Andy sat down with me. "What was that all about?" Andy whispered. I'm not really sure," I whispered back. "Well, what did she say?" Josh whispered. "She said it wasn't fair to Teddy, but I'm the one for her." "Lucky you." Andy smirked. "She said when she's 30 and I've 25 it won't be a big deal," I said. "She said I'll be like the Incredible Hulk." "And who will she be?" Josh asked with a wink. "Jabba the Hutt. Still think it's so great to be big and strong?" Andy asked. "You can eat more pizza," I said. Andy groaned. We finished our ice cream. As we went out the door, Bertha caught my eye. She was sitting by herself at a table, eating the biggest ice cream sundae I'd ever seen. The way she gestured at me made it pretty obvious that she hoped I'd ditch my friends and come back later. Outside in the dark, we turned down a snowy side street, taking a shortcut back to our neighborhood. I hate to say it, but I'm almost ready to go back to school, Andy said. Yeah, just hanging around every day gets to be a drag, Josh agreed. Especially when it's cold and you can't do stuff outside. How about you, Jake? Andy asked. Ready to go to school and get your old body back? I shrugged. I don't know, guys. No matter what you say, I like being big and powerful. I'm not sure if I'm ready to give it up. Even if it makes you dumb. Josh asked. Before I could answer, a bunch of dirtbags stepped into the street in front of us. They were holding baseball bats and axe handles. It looked like they'd been waiting for us. We quickly turned around. Another bunch appeared behind us. We were surrounded.